So Matt, we're very curious. You guys publish a great Sunday column on the roundup of the news that's coming out of Russia, and we're curious. What is the viewpoint on Ukraine right now after this most recent escalation?
Well, what I saw on Vesta Daily today was a piece on allegedly on Ukraine trying to involve itself in the U.S. electoral campaign, and with Dmitry Kiselyov referring to this as something akin to Watergate. It was rather strange, and to me it didn't make a lot of sense, although we've heard a bit of this before. There was also some coverage of Putin's visit to Hungary to meet with Viktor Orban, and which mentioned the fact that there were protesters there wearing Ukrainian flags. It was not entirely clear who these protesters were. There was a suggestion that they were actual Ukrainians who had fled to Hungary and were somehow protesting from there. But it struck me, based on the short interview with one of them, that she didn't seem like a native speaker of Ukrainian or Russian, for that matter. So it was quite clear to me. Although I should say that on the whole, I think this topic, Ukraine for Russia, has really become a secondary one. It's not as big of a topic as it was before, yet at the same time, they still like to use it on the news, at least as a bit of a scarecrow. And they also tend to present a certain view on different reports in the West. For example, today they cited a Politico article on the fact that Yulia Tymoshenko reportedly had a conversation with U.S. President Donald Trump at the National Prayer Breakfast. But the news quoted only the rebuttal from the Poroshenko administration, which said that it was not really a meeting, and it presented that as reality because they apparently did not want to comment on the fact or show the fact that reportedly Trump told Tymoshenko that the U.S. would not remove sanctions from Russia unless progress was made on Ukraine.
And what about the phone call between President Poroshenko and President Trump? Did that receive much airplay in Russia?
From what I've seen so far, I didn't see much of it. I didn't see much. That said, from the readouts that I read of this phone call, it doesn't strike me as particularly telling. There isn't a lot there. It's a fairly standard readout from the presidential administration of Ukraine. It's a very short one from the White House with a rather bizarre phrasing that refers to working with Ukraine and Russia to restore peace on the border, something which perhaps is just a shorthand way of describing the situation that's not very tactful, not very accurate, or perhaps could suggest that the Trump administration doesn't entirely understand what's going on, which normally I would assume the former, but in the case of the Trump administration, I could possibly see the latter.
And we asked this question to Lucien as well, but it's always interesting to get somebody else's take on it. With regards to Ukraine's neighbor to the north, Belarus, there was some interesting things happening between the words that were coming out of Lukashenko's mouth this week regarding Putin. Can you explain what you saw on Russian media with regards to what Lukashenko said?
To be honest, I didn't see that much, although it's possible I missed it. That said, Lukashenko's words I wouldn't take as extremely meaningful. This is not to say that it's not an interesting moment in Russian-Belarusian relations, but this is not the first spat they've had, and it does stem from what appears to be some kind of a real concern regarding the border, that Belarus extended this visa-free regime for 5 days to citizens of 80 countries, and because there is no formal border with Russia, that raises some issues for Russia. That said, I think it's also an issue of the Belarus's jockeying to position itself between Russia and the West. This has become a more important issue recently, especially after the start of the Ukraine crisis. The Ukraine crisis has actually been, in some ways, beneficial for Lukashenko to a certain degree, because he's been able to position himself as a negotiator. They lifted the U.S. sanctions on Belarus, in part because of the Minsk process, and Belarus has managed to make some statements that assert its independence from Russia. And there's no doubt that Belarus is concerned about this situation, because after the start of the Ukraine crisis, after the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the conflict in the Donbass, I had contacts who worked with different organizations that had connections to Central Asia and post-Soviet states, and they said many of their contacts there were quite afraid and they couldn't get people to talk with them. I think we should not doubt the fact that Belarus is very concerned, and any situation in which it can assert its independence is now important.
Matt, For those of us who don't follow the Russian media all that close, is there anything that's being said that you think might be underreported in the West? I mean, everybody's making a big deal out of the way that the Russians are covering Trump, but is there anything else that's sort of lurking beneath the surface there that you think maybe deserves a little more attention or might surprise some people?
You know, I wouldn't say so. One of the issues with the Russian media is that it isn't necessarily reflective of the reality. So I've actually followed Russian coverage of Trump fairly closely, and I followed the reactions in Russian society. I was at both events held by a group of what I would call ultra patriots, Russian ultra patriots in support of Trump. The first, a election watching party; the second, an inauguration watching party. And what I can say is the media is very, very pro-Trump. These ultra patriots were initially very pro-Trump, and their first election watching party was very raucous. There was a lot of energy. People were drinking. It was quite fun in a certain way. Their second inauguration watching party, they were very careful to stress this is not a party, it's not a celebration, it's a platform for discussion, what's going to happen, it's a platform just for discussing the possibility of improvement of U.S.-Russia relations. I would say, in terms of the Russian media coverage of Trump, we should really look beyond it because they say very positive things about Trump in the Russian media. They defend him. I think that the decision makers, in contrast to the newsmakers, these are people who are saying to themselves, there's some possibility here. There's a possibility for improvement of relations, but it's very unsure. And I think they're guardedly optimistic, but they're not certain. And they have no reason to be certain. If I look at what's happened with Trump recently, some of the statements made by him or people from his administration regarding Ukraine, compared to the statements, his very pro-Russia statements, I would say that the advice for Ukraine would be don't necessarily take Trump at his word when he says that they won't lift sanctions on Russia. And the advice for Russia would be don't necessarily assume you can not take Trump at his word when he says that he won't lift sanctions unless there's progress on Ukraine. I don't think we know what's going to happen. Several weeks where they reported that he had very few cabinet posts filled, including all the deputy and deputy secretary or undersecretary, deputy secretary. Although I haven't seen recent numbers, I don't think they're filled. And if we look at Trump's first 2 weeks, it's been very chaotic. I would say that the U.S. policy on both Russia and Ukraine is going to be a work in progress, and I would not draw any conclusions. And I would not necessarily assume that what the Russian media says about Trump is a reflection of reality.